There is one thing that unsettles a woman far more than your anger, your frustration, or even your departure. It is watching you become genuinely at peace without her. Most men never discover this because they react exactly the way she expects them to react. They argue. They defend themselves. They send messages trying to explain what went wrong. They chase closure. They chase understanding. They chase one final conversation that will somehow make her see their worth. And every time they do, they unknowingly hand away the very thing that made them powerful. Because when a woman stops appreciating your presence, she often assumes something dangerous. She assumes you will keep showing up anyway. She assumes your desire for her is stronger than your respect for yourself. So she becomes comfortable giving less effort, comfortable being inconsistent, comfortable knowing that no matter how distant she becomes, you will still be there trying to reconnect the pieces. Then something changes. Not because you threaten to leave, not because you try to punish her, not because you suddenly become cold. You simply stop participating in a dynamic that no longer honors your value. And that is where the entire energy shifts. In this video, we are going to explore what affects a woman the most when she takes you for granted, why calm detachment creates more impact than emotional reactions, and how reclaiming your attention changes everything. Because the final lesson is not about making her suffer. It is about becoming the man who finally recognizes his own worth. Let's begin. The first thing you must understand is this: stop rewarding behavior that does not deserve your energy. Many men think they are giving love when, in reality, they are feeding entitlement. There is a difference. Sometimes a woman keeps a man close not because she deeply values him, but because she enjoys the certainty of his attention. She knows he will answer. She knows he will forgive. She knows he will explain. She knows he will stay available no matter how many times she pulls away. And over time, that certainty becomes a source of comfort for her, not because she earned it, because it became unconditional. Imagine a man named Daniel. For months, he found himself trapped in the same cycle. When she became distant, he moved closer. When she grew quiet, he checked in. When she cancelled plans, he made new ones. Every time uncertainty appeared, he responded with even more effort. At first, it felt noble, patient, understanding. But eventually he noticed something painful. The more he gave, the less his effort seemed to matter. His consistency had become expected. His kindness had become ordinary. His availability had become invisible. Then one evening she cancelled another plan at the last minute. No sincere apology, no attempt to make it right. Just a short message and an assumption that he would understand. Normally he would have reassured her. Normally he would have smoothed everything over. This time he didn't. He responded politely, then he stepped back. No emotional speech, no dramatic exit, no attempt to prove a point. He simply stopped rewarding the pattern. Days later, she reached out expecting the same version of him. The familiar version, the predictable version, the man whose attention was always waiting. But something felt different. His energy was no longer chasing. His words were no longer trying to earn connection. For the first time, his attention was no longer guaranteed. That is where self-respect begins. Not when you become bitter. Not when you try to make someone jealous. Not when you play games. It begins when you stop investing premium energy into someone who treats your presence like an option. A disciplined man understands something most people never learn. Attention is valuable. Time is valuable. Emotional investment is valuable. And anything valuable should be given where it is appreciated. If someone repeatedly brings confusion, you do not respond with deeper devotion. If someone repeatedly creates distance, you do not respond with endless pursuit. If someone repeatedly ignores your value, you do not continue rewarding the behavior that caused the problem. You quietly remove access to what they stopped respecting. And that absence often creates a realization your explanations never could. Because people rarely notice the importance of something while it is constantly available. They notice it when it is no longer there. Which brings us to the next lesson. Most men misunderstand silence. They think silence is about getting a reaction. It is not. Real silence is about reclaiming yourself. If you stop messaging her but spend every day checking her profile, that is not silence. If you stop calling but secretly hope she notices, that is not silence. If your entire withdrawal is designed to make her respond, then emotionally, you are still attached. True silence is different. It is clean, it is calm, it asks for nothing, it does not announce itself, it does not demand attention, it simply removes your presence from a place where your value was being overlooked. And that is exactly where most people make a discovery that changes everything. Because sooner or later she begins to notice that the rhythm she became accustomed to has disappeared. The messages are gone, the explanations are gone, the predictable reactions are gone. And for the first time, she is left facing something she never expected. A version of you she can no longer control. Meanwhile, another man found himself learning this lesson in a very different way. His name was James. And what happened next would completely change how he viewed access, attention, and the illusion of power. For years, James never questioned that access. If she disappeared for days and suddenly resurfaced, he welcomed her back. If she reached out only when she felt lonely, he made room. If she offered a small moment of affection after weeks of uncertainty, he treated it like progress. And little by little, something happened that he never noticed. His presence became expected, not appreciated, expected. One evening, his phone lit up with her name. The familiar message appeared. Short, casual, as though nothing had happened. The old version of James would have answered immediately. He would have felt that familiar surge of hope, convincing himself that maybe this time things were changing. But this time he saw something different. Not the words, the pattern. And once a man sees the pattern clearly, the fantasy begins to lose its grip. He waited, not to punish her, not to play games, simply because he no longer felt obligated to abandon himself every time she reached out. The following day, he replied with calm honesty, "I don't think this works for me anymore." That was all. No emotional essay, no accusations, no attempt to make her feel guilty. Just a man quietly reclaiming something he had been giving away for too long. And that brings us to a truth many men resist. Your attention is not public property. Your emotional availability is not an unlimited resource. Your patience is not something people are entitled to simply because they want access to it. A disciplined man understands this. He guards his energy the same way he guards his peace, not out of fear, out of respect, because once access becomes unlimited, value often disappears. When someone can repeatedly ignore your standards and still receive your best effort, they stop feeling the weight of what you offer. That is why boundaries matter, not because they change her, because they change you. You stop answering every emotional summons. You stop becoming available whenever she decides she wants comfort. You stop offering intimacy where respect is missing. And suddenly the dynamic shifts. Before, she knew exactly where you stood. Now there is uncertainty. Before, she could predict your response. Now she encounters restraint. Before, your feelings kept the door open no matter what happened. Now your standards stand at the entrance. And standards are much harder to negotiate with than emotions. This is why calm withdrawal often creates more impact than confrontation. Because anger still gives access. Anger still creates engagement. Anger still allows someone to occupy your mind. But when access quietly disappears, the entire structure changes, which leads directly into the next lesson. Peace. Real peace. Not the kind people perform online. Not the kind that needs validation. The kind that grows when you finally stop fighting battles that were draining your soul. Most men believe their anger will make the strongest statement. It rarely does. Anger tells the world you are wounded. Peace tells the world you have healed. And those are very different messages. When someone has grown accustomed to seeing your reactions, they often expect more of the same. They expect resistance, arguments, emotional conversations, attempts to fix what they continue breaking. But when they encounter calm instead, something unexpected happens. The script they depended on begins to fall apart, because now there is nothing left to push against. The ancient Stoics understood this deeply. Your power was never found in controlling another person's choices. It was found in controlling your response to those choices. You cannot decide whether someone values you. You cannot force appreciation. You cannot negotiate respect into existence. But you can decide whether your inner world remains dependent on their behavior. That is where freedom begins. And freedom feels different. You still remember the memories. You still remember the connection. You still remember what could have been. But those memories no longer control your direction. You stop building your future around someone's inconsistency. You stop measuring your worth through their attention. You stop making their approval the center of your emotional universe. Instead, you return to yourself. You focus on your work, your health, your purpose, your friendships, your growth. You stop turning your healing into a performance, because real peace does not need an audience. Many men miss this point. They become obsessed with appearing unbothered. They want her to notice how well they are doing. They want her to hear about their success. They want her to witness their transformation. But if your improvement still depends on her seeing it, then she is still influencing your peace. True peace is quieter. It exists even when nobody notices. It exists when nobody applauds. It exists when your life improves simply because you finally decided to stop abandoning yourself. And that kind of peace creates a realization many people never expect. Because sooner or later she notices that your world kept moving, not because you were trying to prove something, not because you wanted revenge, because you genuinely moved forward. Then comes another mistake that keeps countless men trapped long after they should have walked away. They keep trying to explain themselves. They keep trying to make someone understand what has already been made clear. And that is where a man can unknowingly surrender his power all over again. Because there is a moment when explaining your heart stops being communication and starts becoming a plea for validation, and that is exactly where the next shift happens. Because the moment you stop explaining yourself, something else begins to weaken, her ability to influence your emotions. Let's be honest, my friend, control is rarely loud. Most of the time it arrives through small patterns that repeat themselves over and over again. A delayed reply that ruins your mood. A cold response that sends you searching for answers. A sudden burst of affection that makes you forget every boundary you promised yourself you would keep. That is how emotional control works. Not through force, through reaction. As long as someone can predict your reaction, they can predict your behavior. And that is why a man regains his freedom by becoming less reactive. Not colder, not crueler, simply more grounded. You stop treating every emotional shift as a crisis. You stop assuming every silence requires an explanation. You stop believing every distant moment must be repaired by your effort. As the Stoic philosopher Epictetus taught, no person is truly free until they learn to govern themselves. Think about that. If her attention determines your confidence, are you free? If her approval determines your peace, are you free? If her withdrawal can instantly pull you out of your center, are you free? Probably not. Freedom begins the moment your emotional state stops depending on another person's behavior, and that realization changes everything, because now you begin observing instead of reacting. You pause before answering. You think before responding. You stop allowing emotions to make decisions that your future self will regret. Most men never notice how much information they reveal through reactions. Every defensive explanation, every attempt to prove their worth, every emotional response to disrespect, all of it communicates the same thing. You still have access to my emotional world. A disciplined man learns to close that door, not through hostility, through composure. He understands that not every accusation deserves a defense. Not every misunderstanding deserves correction. Not every test deserves participation. Sometimes the strongest response is simply refusing to enter the game. And when that happens, people often become uncomfortable, especially those who benefited from your reactions. Do not be surprised if she notices the change. She may say you are different. She may accuse you of pulling away. She may suddenly become warmer than she has been in months, not because she has transformed overnight, but because the familiar pattern has been interrupted. The old emotional buttons no longer work. The predictable reactions no longer arrive. And suddenly she is standing in front of a version of you she cannot read as easily as before. That is quiet strength. No speeches, no dramatic declarations, just self-command. Because true freedom is not making someone else lose control. It is refusing to surrender yours. And once you understand that, another realization follows naturally. The greatest proof of growth is not what you say after someone undervalues you. It is the life you build afterward. Nothing challenges old assumptions more than genuine progress, not the kind you post online. Not the kind designed to make someone jealous, the real kind, the kind that changes who you are when nobody is watching. Consider a man named David. For years he invested enormous energy into a woman who enjoyed his presence but rarely honored its value. Whenever she needed support, he was there. Whenever she wanted attention, he answered. Whenever she felt uncertain, he became her source of stability. Yet when he needed consistency in return, excuses appeared, promises faded, effort disappeared. Eventually, David grew tired of chasing moments that never lasted, so he redirected his energy, quietly, without announcements, without revenge, without trying to prove anything. He returned to the gym. He strengthened family relationships he had neglected. He invested in business opportunities. He improved his routines. He upgraded his standards. Most importantly, he stopped building his life around someone else's inconsistency. At first, nothing seemed different. Then people started noticing. His posture changed. His confidence changed. His energy changed. He seemed lighter, sharper, more focused. Months later, he crossed paths with her again. And something unexpected happened. For the first time, he wasn't searching her face for approval. He wasn't hoping for validation. He wasn't secretly waiting for a sign. He was simply present, comfortable in himself. That is what real growth looks like. Not becoming better so someone regrets losing you. Becoming better because you finally recognize your own value. There is a massive difference. Revenge keeps another person at the center of your story. Growth puts you back at the center of your own. You improve your body because you respect yourself. You improve your finances because your future matters. You strengthen your mind because peace is worth protecting. And over time, your entire life becomes more difficult to disturb. Her distance no longer weakens you. Her attention no longer defines you. Her confusion no longer controls your direction. You become a man whose life cannot be paused by another person's uncertainty. And that naturally leads to one final challenge many men face. Because even after they begin growing, even after they reclaim their standards, even after they stop chasing, there is still one trap capable of pulling them right back into the same cycle: drama. And most men never realize how much of their energy disappears there until they finally step outside of it and see what it was costing them all along. And that is why the next step matters more than most men realize. Because once you stop feeding chaos, reclaim your attention, and rebuild your center, there is one final lesson left to learn. Become difficult to take for granted. Not difficult to love. Not difficult to connect with. Difficult to use. There is a difference. Many good men spend years confusing generosity with endless availability. They answer every call. They solve every problem. They forgive every disappointment. They keep showing up long after respect has stopped showing up with them. Then they wonder why their value seems invisible. The answer is often simple. What is always available is rarely appreciated. Think about a man named Richard, reliable, steady, the kind of man people describe as dependable. Whenever the woman in his life needed support, he stepped forward. If she was overwhelmed, he listened. If she needed help, he made time. If she felt alone, he answered. Yet when he needed consistency, she became uncertain. When he asked for effort, excuses appeared. When he wanted reciprocity, he was told he was asking for too much. For a long time, Richard convinced himself that patience would eventually be rewarded, but patience without standards becomes permission. And one evening he finally understood that. After days of silence, she reached out asking for another favor. Nothing unusual, nothing urgent. Just another moment where she expected his availability. The old Richard would have rearranged his schedule immediately. Instead, he paused. Then he answered with calm honesty, "I can't do that anymore." No anger, no lecture, no resentment, just a boundary. For the first time, he stopped confusing being needed with being valued, and that realization changed everything, because some people do not fully recognize your worth until access to it becomes limited. Not out of cruelty, simply because human nature often overlooks what appears guaranteed. That is why a self-respecting man learns to be selective with his energy. He remains kind, but not endlessly available. He remains generous, but not endlessly sacrificial. He remains open, but not unguarded. His warmth is genuine, yet it is no longer handed to people who repeatedly treat it carelessly. And there is something powerful about that kind of presence. You stop becoming a convenience. You become a choice. Your attention carries weight. Your time carries weight. Your loyalty carries weight, because it is given with intention rather than desperation. And eventually you reach the final stage, the stage where you stop trying to make someone recognize what they failed to appreciate. You simply leave, not with bitterness, not with revenge, not with a final performance designed to create regret. You leave with dignity. That is what it means to leave as the blessing. A blessing does not argue for its value. A blessing does not stand outside the door demanding recognition. A blessing does not keep returning to places where it is repeatedly mishandled. It simply moves on. And sometimes the absence teaches what presence never could. This is the part many men struggle with. Because deep down, they still want understanding. They still want acknowledgement. They still want the other person to finally realize what was standing in front of them all along. But the more you chase that realization, the further it moves away. There comes a moment when self-respect asks a different question. Not, will she ever understand? But, why am I still waiting for her to? That question changes everything, because now the focus returns where it belongs. Back to you. Back to your standards. Back to your peace. Back to the life waiting beyond the emotional cycle that kept draining you. You do not have to pretend the connection meant nothing. You do not have to deny the memories. You do not have to act cold to prove you are strong. Strength is not the absence of feeling. Strength is the ability to feel deeply without abandoning yourself. You can acknowledge what was good. You can appreciate what was real. You can even admit that part of you hoped it would become something more. And still decide that being undervalued is a price you are no longer willing to pay. That is maturity. That is discipline. That is self-respect. Sometimes the person who failed to appreciate you was never meant to stay forever. Sometimes they appeared to reveal something important, not who they were, who you needed to become, because every moment you tolerated less than you deserved pointed toward a lesson. Every excuse you accepted, every boundary you ignored, every time you traded peace for attention, those moments showed you exactly where your growth was waiting. And once you learn the lesson, you no longer need the pain. You stop chasing, you stop explaining, you stop negotiating your worth. You build, you heal, you move forward, quietly, steadily. The woman who undervalued you may understand one day. She may not. That chapter belongs to her. Yours is different. Your chapter begins the moment your peace is no longer up for negotiation. The moment you stop asking others to confirm your value and start living as though you already know it. Because in the end, what affects people most is not your anger, not your arguments, not your attempts to prove what they lost. It is the calm certainty of a man who finally remembers who he is. And there is something unforgettable about a man who walks away carrying his dignity instead of his resentment. A man who chooses peace instead of pursuit. A man who leaves without needing the last word. Because long after the noise fades, long after the explanations disappear, and long after the story itself is over, the thing people remember most is often the thing you never had to say.